Witchwater by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 5. Even more alarming than the bicycle against the fence were the crows that circled the roof of the old house, indicating that Mouse was indeed inside. They looked like buzzards, Lynn thought, vultures making their last slow revolution before swooping down on the victim. She ran up the walk, onto the porch, and grabbed the brass knocker, banging it hard against the door. Nothing happened. She banged again and again, panic rising inside her, and then began yelling, "Mouse! Mouse!" The door opened and Marjorie herself answered. "What are you doing here?" Lynn demanded. "Looking for Stevie." There were more footsteps, and Mrs. Tuggle came through the dark hall. Her voice had the usual lilting grandmotherly tone, but her eyes, as she faced Lynn, were sharp and hard, and there was no softness in the look which passed between them. "Stevie has not been here at all," she said, "but if I see him, I'll be sure to send him running along home." Lynn did not answer. "Come on, Mouse," she said, and taking her arm, pulled her down the sidewalk and out the gate. Out of sight, behind the thorn apple tree, Lynn wheeled around and faced Marjorie. "What were you doing in there all by yourself, Mouse? Why on earth did you come up here alone?" Marjorie stared at her. "I was looking for Stevie, like you said. But you didn't have to go to Mrs. Tuggle's, and you certainly didn't have to go inside. Why did you go inside, Mouse?" Marjorie's lips trembled. "I was asking for Stevie at the house across the street, and Mrs. Tuggle came out and called me over and took me inside and said she'd see if he was playing out back. She could have told you that on the porch, Mouse. Did you say anything else? Did she say anything else? Think now. Anything at all?" Mouse looked pale and scared. She said she liked my ring and asked to try it on." Lynn grabbed Mouse by the shoulders and shook her back and forth till the glasses slipped off her nose and hung by one ear. "Mouse, are you crazy? Are you absolutely nuts? Don't you know what she's up to?" Marjorie started to cry, and Lynn was instantly sorry. Huge blobs of tears rolled down out of Marjorie's eyes, matting her lashes, and dropped off her chin onto her green jacket. Lynn put one arm around her, and they sat down by the fence. "Oh, Mouse, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I'm just so scared and worried about you, and you didn't take the ring off, did you? No. You knocked at the door just then." She started to cry again. "But I might have. Oh, Lynn, she can talk me into anything. Anybody can talk me into anything. I'm nothing but marshmallow inside." Lynn put both arms around her and rocked her gently. "Mouse, please listen to me. You're stronger than you think. You've got to believe in yourself. You can stay away from Mrs. Tuggle if you really try. You mustn't ever see her alone. Never come here again by yourself. The fact that she wanted you to take off the ring proves that it is some kind of protection against her, and she knows it. That's why she sent her cat to destroy the book, even if it's only psychological protection. Even if you're only stronger because you think the ring makes you stronger, it's harder for her to get you into her corner, don't you see?" Mouse continued to sob. She put her face down on her knees and rocked back and forth. "Lynn, I'll never make it. I'm tired of fighting it. What's the use? Sometimes she just seems like a harmless old lady. She was so sweet and kind to me in there, and she seemed so concerned and said if I ever wanted to talk to somebody like Mother, I could just come up here any time." Lynn felt as though all the blood had drained out of her body and left ice in its place. Of course Mrs. Tuggle was going to play mother to Mouse and Marjorie, wanting so desperately she could hardly refuse. Marjorie, wanting it so desperately, could hardly refuse. What could Lynn possibly do about it? She couldn't be her mother. Should she write Mrs. Beasley and tell her to come back, that Mouse needed her? No, she knew that wouldn't work. Then Mr. Beasley would never let Lynn out in the house again. She sat with her arms around Mouse until the sobbing finally stopped. Mouse seemed so tiny, so vulnerable, like Stevie almost, and suddenly she remembered her lost brother and leapt up. "Oh, Mouse, I forgot all about Stevie. If anything's happened to him." "He wasn't in her house, Lynn. We looked." The girls jumped on Marjorie's bike. Lynn sat on the seat, her hands on Marjorie's waist, and Mouse stood upon the pedals. They were careening out into the street and down the hill to the Morleys. Lynn felt that things were closing in on her. How could she possibly protect Mouse and Stevie at the same time? How could she fight off crows and cats or do anything at all if no one believed her? When they were a block from the house, they could see Judith standing on the porch waving at them and calling, We found Stevie, she said as they rode up onto the sidewalk. He'd followed Mrs. Tuggle's cat out in the meadow and was playing down by the creek. Lynn felt both relieved and frightened as she walked in the house beside Mouse. Stevie was safe for the moment, but he had known better than to go to the creek. He'd been told as long as he could remember that he should never go there alone. The cat had lured him there. The cat was evil, and Lynn felt a deep hatred for the animal stir up somewhere inside her. The cat, even more than the crows, was her enemy. Mrs. Tuggle would get at her any way she could, through Stevie even. If Mrs. Morley knew that Mouse needed extra mothering that day, it was by intuition only. Whatever, as soon as the girls walked in, she grabbed them both and hugged them hard. It was, Lynn realized, mostly a reaction to having found Stevie safe and sound, even though he'd been sent to his room for the rest of the day. Marjorie, I haven't seen you for at least a week, Mother said. How are you, dear? She looked at her more closely, and Lynn wondered if she noticed the streaks that the tears had left on her face. Okay, Mouse said. It was easy to lie. Lynn was thinking, why did people always say okay or fine when they weren't at all? Why did they have to pretend things were going great when they were going terribly? But if Mouse had answered, I'm lonely, Mrs. Morley and the witches are after me, would it have done any good? Would anyone have believed her? I found some old piano music the other day when I was house cleaning, and I thought of you right away, Mouse said, putting an arm around Mouse and leading her into the music room. There are a lot of typos in this book, and I have been reading them all as they go along, so if something sounds funny, it's because I'm just reading the typos. If you like any of it, you can take it home with you. They sat down together on the piano bench, and Mrs. Morley opened one of the scores. You play the treble clef, and I'll play the bass, and it will give you an idea of how it sounds. I'm not very good, Mouse grinned, but she liked the idea of a duet. Neither am I, said Mother. We'll make a great pair. If only they could keep Mouse here with them, Lynn thought as she sat on the window seat and watched Marjorie and her mother laughing together. If they could sort of adopt her to keep Mrs. Tuggle... If they could sort of adopt her to keep until Mrs. Tuggle died or something. But she knew that would never work. Mr. Beasley was too fond of his daughter to give her up. No, the most important thing was to see that Mouse kept that ring on her finger no matter what. And because they knew that Mrs. Tuggle wanted it, things seemed scarier than ever. That evening, Lynn did something she had not intended to do. Some of it, that is. She knew how her mother regarded the idea of witchcraft, and she knew how disgusted her father was at people who gossiped about Mrs. Tuggle, or anybody else for that matter. Accusations were not permitted in a courtroom without evidence, he always said, and he often mistook the Morley house for a courtroom. But once in a while, Lynn thought, she caught a glimpse of uncertainty in her parents' eyes, a trace of doubt in their voices when they spoke of the old woman. And so, when Lynn walked in the kitchen that evening and found them standing at the window, their arms around each other, they seemed so relaxed and good-humored that she realized if ever she was going to tell them, now was the time. Things were happening too fast, and perhaps even Stevie was in danger. She just had to tell someone. Good apple, Mr. Morley said, holding a wine sap up for inspection. Ought to try one, Lynn. I picked these up at Grossman's Market, first of the season. He sat down in the chair by the table and stretched out his legs while Mother looked over some shopping coupons on the counter. I don't want anything more to eat, Lynn said. She sat down across from him and tucked her feet under her. Dad, I'm scared. Mother turned around. Of what? If I tell you, could we have a serious discussion without anybody getting mad? I'll try my best, her father promised. Lynn took a deep breath. Okay, I know how you both feel about Mrs. Tuggle. I know you like her, Mother, and think she's a sweet old lady, and I agree with you, Dad, that people shouldn't go around spreading gossip unless they have proof, but that doesn't stop the scared feeling. Mr. Morley took another bite of apple and surveyed his daughter quizzically. So you're afraid of Mrs. Tuggle, a frail old lady like her? Yes. Why? What can she possibly do to hurt you, Lynn? I think she's trying to get Mouse into her coven. She stopped as both parents began to smile. I know it sounds funny, but awful things are happening. Marjorie and I went down by the creek one day, and Mrs. Tuggle was walking along the other side, and she called to the crows, and 9 of them flew down and landed on her arms. Really? Mother said, interested. I didn't know crows could be that tame. Neither did I, but she talked to them, Mother, like they all had names. Well, I don't know, Lynn, her father said. All the women who live in cities often go to the park and feed and talk to pigeons. You want us to burn her at the stake for that? Dad, ever since then, those 9 crows have been following Mouse around, and she's done worse and worse in school. Every day they follow her from tree to tree, and she's scared to death. We went down to her father's store one day to tell him about it, and the crows followed us down there. But when he came outside to look, they were gone. It's witchcraft. Now, Lynn, Mr. Morley threw his apple core in the sink and leaned forward. You're an intelligent girl. Think about what you just said. It sounds pretty kooky, doesn't it? You want us to believe that 9 crows are following Marjorie Beasley around, yet no one can see them but you? And Marjorie. And once somebody at school noticed them. I mean, they're not invisible or anything. It's just as soon as someone else notices them, they fly away. Mother stood leaning against the refrigerator, her eyes on Lynn, her face anxious. Then she gave her husband a hurried glance and sat down at the table between them. Sweetheart, she said, and her voice was soft and gentle, the way she sounded when Lynn had been ill with strep throat. We love you, and we're concerned about you, and it's quite possible that there are strange things about Mrs. Tuggle that you, being very observant, have noticed, and that Marjorie, being very suggestible, has seemed to notice too. Mrs. Tuggle is rather eccentric, and unless one sees her every day as I do, it's easy to suppose she's a witch. I guess. Imagination can play strange tricks. But I really think we've reached a point where your ideas are not really normal. Mother, believe me, it's not just an idea, it's fact. It's really true. The crows are there. Mrs. Morley stared down at her hands on the table and fell silent. Lynn, Mr. Morley took it up now. Is there anything else you're worried about these days besides Mrs. Tuggle? Anything at all that you haven't told us apart from witches and stuff? Are there problems at school, maybe? No, what else would I be worried about? Again, the look passed between her parents, and Lynn sat wondering. You know, Lynn, there's a school psychologist for the county who is great at helping boys and girls work on problems that are troubling them, Mother said. Sometimes people have worries they're not even aware of, and when they're gradually helped to talk about them with someone outside the family, someone qualified to help, things don't seem so frightening anymore. I think it might be a good idea to arrange a conference. Dad and I could go along if you like. Or you could go alone, but Lynn started to cry more out of frustration than anything else. I don't have any worries except Mrs. Tuggle and Mouse and what's going to happen to her, she sobbed angrily. You just can't understand what I'm talking about. You can't believe that I'm telling the truth. She jumped up and started for the hallway. Someday, if anything happens to Mouse, everyone is going to remember that I tried to warn you. And then with tears streaming down her cheeks, she bolted up the stairs and sank down on the landing, burying her face in her arms. She hadn't even told them the rest. She hadn't told them about the photograph of Mrs. Tuggle's brother and the cat's spider-mark medallion. She hadn't told them how she had gone to Mrs. Tuggle's and accused her of being a witch, and how the old woman hadn't denied it. She hadn't told them how the cat clawed up Mr. Beasley's book on spells and potions, or how Mrs. Tuggle tried to get the ring off Marjorie's finger. She hadn't even mentioned her fears for Stevie. She was ashamed of herself. She had asked that they have a serious discussion without anyone getting mad, and it was she who had left the room. If she was really mature and reasonable, she would march right back down there and tell them the rest. But then she heard her parents' voices from the kitchen and sat listening. But why are you angry at me? Mother's voice was plaintive. Oh, I'm not angry at anybody, Mr. Morley responded gruffly. I'm just disgusted that we haven't done a better job of keeping her imagination in check. She ought to get out more, make new friends. Put 2 girls together like Lynn and that bird-brained Beasley kid, throw in an idea, and you've got an explosion. I think Marjorie's a very nice girl, Mother defended. I didn't say she wasn't, but she'll believe anything. Lynn could make her believe the sky is celery soup if she tried. When Lynn gets an idea in her head, there's no stopping her. Well, if you're not angry at me, you certainly sound like it by the tone of your voice. There was a noise of a chair scraping the floor, and Lynn knew that her mother was standing up. Is it my fault that Lynn doesn't spend her time going to parties and playing soccer or something? No, but I think it's interesting that she didn't get those ridiculous ideas about Mrs. Tuggle until you started writing books about witches. That's not true, Mother's voice was angry now. I got the idea from her. If it hadn't been for her imagination, that book would never have got off the ground. So you just reinforce it, Father said. As soon as she started talking about the idea, we should have sat on it. Instead, the whole house is inhabited by imaginary spirits. And what do you want me to do, Richard? Give up writing? Be afraid to explore an idea for fear Lynn will pick it up and blow it all out of proportion? Is that... Lynn scrambled up from the floor of the landing and rushed upstairs to second and then the narrow stairway to her room at the top, flinging herself on the bed. Why had she ever brought the subject up? What made her think she could ever tell them? If she didn't be careful, they might separate just like Mr. and Mrs. Beasley had done, and it would be all her fault. She would never mention it again. Never, never. She would pretend that all her fears were over and that she and Mrs. Tuggle were friends. Whatever happened from now on, she was on her own. She was even more alone than she had suspected. What's the matter? Lynn wondered if she had been asleep because she hadn't heard Judith come upstairs. She rolled over. Judith was standing there with a book she'd been reading on her side of the curtain. You've just been lying there for 20 minutes, Judith said. Sick or something? No, I'm okay. Lynn sat up. Have you ever tried to explain something to Mom and Dad and they just couldn't understand what you meant? Judith thought for a minute. Yes. What? I tried to tell them last week I'm in love with Doug Heinzelman, but I could tell they didn't believe me. How could you tell? By what they said. Judith leaned against Lynn's dresser and flopped her long black hair over her shoulders. Mother said that I have a lot of living yet to do, and not to be too upset if something happens between Doug and me. I mean, wasn't that a dumb thing to say right after I told her we were in love? Already she's talking about our breaking up. Yes, Lynn thought that was a dumb thing to say, but just because a person was an adult didn't mean they couldn't do anything stupid. Besides, breaking up could happen to anybody. If the Beasleys did it, it could happen to Judith and Doug Heinzelman, too. Even Mom and Dad. Oh, why had she said a word about Mrs. Tuggle and made them mad at each other? What were you trying to explain to them that they didn't understand? Judith wanted to know. Oh, nothing. Lynn got up and tried to change the subject. They just don't understand Mouse very well, that's all. Who does? Judith laughed. Nobody understands that girl, not even her father. And then she felt she'd said too much and apologized. Oh, I didn't mean it like that. I feel sorry for her, really. If she'd just think before she put on her clothes in the morning, she wouldn't look so much like a refugee, that's all. Judith started for the stairs. Something darted into the room and streaked behind the curtain. What was that? Lynn asked. It looked like that big cat of Mrs. Tuggle's. Honestly, that animal has been coming in here like he owns the place. She shrugged and started downstairs. Never did care about cats one way or the other. Lynn stood still and waited till she heard Judith reach the floor below. Then she cautiously walked across to the heavy curtain, pulled it aside, and entered Judith's bedroom. The cat was nowhere in sight. Slowly, she circled the room, watching, waiting for the slightest sound. She would not tolerate the cat coming here. She knelt down and looked under the bed. Two gleaming eyes looked back. Get out! Shoo! Lynn said and wiggled the bed. The cat didn't move. Lynn went down to the second-floor bedroom and got a mop from the closet. When she came back up, she thrust the mop under the bed, poking at the cat. Get out! She commanded. The cat backed away and settled down again on its haunches. The helplessness that Lynn had felt earlier was turning now into anger. How dare this animal disobey her? How dare it come into the house? In fury, she shoved the bed to one side and began swinging wildly with the mop this way and that. The cat gave a shriek and flew out from under the bed. It crouched against the wall, its back arched, hissing. Lynn went over to the door and closed it. Then she opened Judith's window, unlatched the storm window, and swung it open, and approached the cat again. Get out, you evil thing, she said through clenched teeth as the cat watched her move. Don't you ever come here again. The cat didn't budge. Suddenly, in fury, Lynn lunged at it with the mop and whacked it hard on the side. The cat spun toward the window, a strange, almost human cry in its throat. It scrambled up to the window ledge and turned its face to Lynn, and turned to face Lynn, its hair on end, eyes huge and yellow. Lynn walked toward it, holding the mop in front of her. I know who you are, she said, and I know what you're trying to do. The cat leaned forward, body balancing on the windowsill as though it were going to jump down into the room again. Then it opened its mouth and snarled. Lynn swung. The mop hit the cat full force, knocking it straight through the open window and onto the roof of the porch below. It paused only a moment on its toes, as though suspended in flight, and then, propelled by the momentum of its fall, leaped onto the grass below, where it stood, eyes upward, tail lashing wildly. "That'll teach you," Lynn said, and pulled the storm window shut. As she did so, the cat uttered another noise that Lynn could not describe even to Mouse. It was a half wail, half laugh that sounded as if it were coming from the throat of a boy. She slumped down on the floor, her heart racing. Maybe she did need the school psychologist after all. When people go bananas, she thought, they don't even know it. They think they're talking sense when everyone around them knows they're talking nonsense. They see things and hear things that no one else can see or hear. "No," she said aloud, "even if nobody else in the world believes me, I've got to believe in myself." She had heard a human voice from the throat of the cat, and it was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. And that's the end of chapter 5.